Over recent years, there's been a spatial turn across the social sciences. This spatial turn has led to a refocusing of attention on the key terms of geography and the effect that these have not only on the subjects and objects of our research, but also on the research encounter itself, on its effect on methodology. So one of the key terms of geography is the notion of place. Following Tim Creswell, the notion of place can be generally understood to have two dimensions. It is at once a geographical as well as a social category. Place can be understood as a locale or a location, but also in a specifically social sense, relating to a position in a group hierarchy or culture. We know this through simple phrases like, "we know our place," or "she knew her place." So in this podcast, we will see whilst many disciplines have done much to demonstrate the significance of the social dimension of place in methodological practice, through, for example, processes of reflexivity with regard to the positionality of researcher and respondent, as we've seen earlier in this series, the influence of the where of location has received much less attention. Concern with the microgeography or the place of the interview is limited to its role in ensuring all parties feel at ease during the potentially intrusive interview process. And whilst this is important, the role that place may play in influencing the knowledge produced during this process, or how place could be harnessed to elicit information on social identity or power relationships, is often ignored. Thus, the turn towards the geographical has not resulted in the difference that place makes to methodology being fully accounted for. As Preston notes, knowledge claims are readily given a social location in terms of gender, race, class, theoretical or cultural context, but they're rarely given a physical location in relation to a particular geographical or material environment. This podcast argues that the geographical dimension of place can fundamentally affect the nature of knowledge accessible through a range of methodological techniques. Through using a range of examples which demonstrate the difference that place makes to method, it proposes that the where of method should be explicitly considered in the practice of qualitative methodology. So work I've done in the past with Katie Jones has documented some of the ways in which place can structure the methodological encounter. In this case, the place in question was that of a school. Schools were the first point of access to talk to young people about their spatial practices in the city. Here I want to talk about two very different locations in the school and how they influenced the methodological encounter. First of all, we'll look at interviews in the classroom. Interviews in the classroom enable practical access to pupils, as well as affording locational insights and languages that outlined nascent personal experiences of young people. However, the proximity of peers and the positioning of authority figures limited the method's capacity to fully access the lived experience of young people. For example, as other pupils in the class worked on computers and talked amongst themselves, a student we will call Ollie and the researcher found a desk at the back of the classroom to sit and talk. Throughout the interview, Ollie adopted the tactic of whispering when talking about what he called not so innocent activities and subjects that he thought could get him into trouble with his teacher. When he talked about getting alcohol, for instance, he would whisper so that only the researcher could hear him. As he said, "Well, usually we get alcohol and go to a couple of different places. We'll just find somewhere a bit out of the way where we can have a laugh, hang around, whatever." So the interview in a classroom was thus relatively successful in revealing useful qualitative insights about the hanging out practices of young people. But it was mobilised but also limited by the very context of the place in which it occurred, the classroom. Perhaps you can think of some of the ways in which the place of the classroom may help but also hinder interviews with young people. The place of the classroom is a geography where adults have positions of authority, and to an extent these school regimes were exploited and appropriated in order to undercover data for research. The place of method therefore to an extent mobilised the research. The teacher granted access to pupils and positioned the researcher as adult, as an important and to be respected individual. However, in equal measure, this place of method also limited the researcher's potential. Although a degree of rapport was built up between the researcher and the pupils, in general these interviews were not relaxed or easy encounters. The teacher remained a panoptical viewer, always keeping an eye and ear on their encounter. and this appeared to have an effect on the type of issues brought up by the pupils and how they would speak about their lives. Coupled to this, the classroom also conferred to the researcher a similar but pseudo-authority as a grown-up, which also to an extent influenced the conversation's limits. So because of problems but also of the potentials of interviewing young people in a school, a new place within the school was chosen to do a second round of interviews. In this case, interviews were undertaken in a cupboard. We all perhaps know the cupboard in the school that I refer to. It's the cupboard in the back of the classroom where teachers keep their overhead projector, spare exercise books, and all the paraphernalia of teaching. They're often not very big spaces, and they're often spaces that students and pupils aren't allowed to go in. As a consequence, interviewing in that cupboard offered a relatively blank canvas and very different space that mobilised the research encounter. So interviews in the schoolroom cupboard offered a relatively blank canvas to pupils who, alongside the researcher, constructed it as a very different place to that of the classroom, a private place, a fun place, even a place of confession. So as a consequence, interviewing in this space was more successful in accessing the intimate and emotional accounts of young people's spatial practices. The physical and social aspects of the store cupboard contributed meaningfully to the interviews here. Interviews in the cupboard became relaxed affairs. The narrowness of the cupboard meant that only 2 chairs could be placed next to each other. However, as friendship groups were often interviewed together, it sometimes meant that 3 or 4 pupils could be able to sit on these just 2 chairs. This often resulted in a great deal of giggling, especially when there was a mixture of males and females in the store cupboard. So by operating within the cupboard, it was possible to destabilise the authority of the researcher within the school environment. Interviews in the cupboard meant that the researcher came to occupy a temporary position, both material and metaphorical, that pivoted her identity. She was no longer positioned by pupils as a teacher or as an adult, but became something different. The store cupboard was a place that young people didn't mind being located in. In fact, they enjoyed it, and they liked talking to the researcher more in this circumstance. It seemed to them as a fun place, so much so that the teacher in the next door classroom would often comment that things seem to be going well, given the amount of giggling I hear coming from the cupboard. In a sense, therefore, the cupboard became the pupils' own space within the school, an intimate space where they felt free to talk about what they wanted. Thus, interviews in a cupboard became more effective in accessing the lived practices of these young people. In different research locations, participants are situated differently with respect to identities and roles that structure their experiences and actions. Consequently, interview participants may offer different kinds of information depending on where they are interviewed. The same research method but in a different context makes a huge difference. We have argued here that place makes a difference to method. The physical location of a particular methodological technique can have a significant influence over the type of languages and intelligences accessible through the research encounter. This paper follows researcher Sin, where he recognises that knowledge is not created simply by the individuals involved, but is constructed by them within dialectical relations that include the place of method. The strategic conflation of place and method was used to get at languages of everyday lived experience, and each was mobilised or restricted by the spatial and social aspects of the location in which it was practised. In whatever space you're going to use for your interviews or ethnography, you should consider the influence that the wear of method might have on the effectiveness of your research tool.